Welcome, everyone. We'll get started shortly.
Oh, wow, so many people. That's cool. Okay.
That was great.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Terrence Parr, and I'm the current director of the Masters in Data Science program at the University of San Francisco. As you can see here, we have a couple of brief announcements on our initial slide here. We have a data ethics certificate starting on March 23rd that you should take a look at. It should be very interesting. It's also the case that we have a few slots left for the graduate program that starts with the boot camp in July. So if you are interested in our data science graduate program, please take a look at that. The other thing we've also just posted, let's see if I can add this to the chat. What's that? Sorry, it fell out of my paste buffer. Okay, so I'm posting a, yes, so there's a question, the applications, we're still accepting them for the MSDS program, still open. Okay, so the other thing I'm posting right here is we've just posted a job for senior director of the Data Institute itself. So if you are interested in learning more about that, you can click on the link that I've pasted in there and the required qualifications and so on. So that job is now officially open. So I'm really happy that Mark Seraphim has agreed to speak to us today. I first met him by kind of accident. I saw an article from a guy that I thought, oh, he's a hell of a machine learning heretic, and I'd like to meet that guy. He kind of thinks the way I do. He's currently working at a company called Graphcore that builds artificial intelligence chips. His graduate work was done at the University of California in San Diego, and he studied computer science and artificial intelligence. He also has a bachelor's degree where he focused on software engineering. As you'll see in this talk, he's done a number of things from game development, AI startup, through Microsoft Program Manager, all sorts of interesting things. He had a couple of interesting things in his article that I'm sure he'll give you a link to, and it's in the meetup list. In the answer to the question, what math do I need for deep learning? And his answer is always just matrix multiply and derivatives of square functions. So that's a little disappointing for faculty that try to push all sorts of fancy magic, but it jives with my own experience that you really just need a little bit of math before you can be successful in these areas. He also has an interesting term that he coined. Instead of gradient descent, analogously, he has graduate student descent as, quote, one of the most reliable ways in getting state-of-the-art performance in machine learning today. So, in terms of mechanics, you should see a Q&A button. So if you have a question, Mark won't be able to see it as he's going through. So you can just go ahead and click on that button and ask away there, and then I'll interrupt Mark and repeat the question to him. Let's see here. We have something in the, you might have posted to all panelists. Sorry, yes. Somebody, it was to the panelists that I posted that. Let me post it to everyone. So I'm reposting the link on the senior director position to everyone, including the attendees. Okay, with that, Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Terrence. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see this okay.
Yep.
All right, yeah, so everyone, it's honestly like a pleasure to be here. Like Terrence was saying, we sort of met like serendipitously after I wrote an article about sort of some stuff I identified around how machine learning research has been really stagnating in recent years. And so we had a long discussion, and a lot of it sort of reflected back to stuff that I learned in my career and how it's shaped how I view my work and my research. And so I thought it'd just be interesting to sort of share the story and how my thinking evolved in this space. So really, but before I get started, like I want to say, never take, advice at face value. So I'm just going to tell you what I did. I'm not going to tell you what you should be doing or what you should be thinking. And if anything, if you're more successful than me or happier or richer, you shouldn't listen to me. You should maybe go do something else in the meantime. Otherwise, if you do have any questions about, like, if you're looking for advice, please ask me specifics. Like tell me exactly the situation you're in, how you would like me to help, and I can help you think through it. But definitely don't just take a slide that I have here and then go make a reckless decision with it. So with that said, like who am I? And generally, the way I like to summarize what I work on is I'm a research engineer that likes to build useful stuff, and I like to write about it. And so I'm really glad that I'm going to be starting a new role working on the PyTorch team at Facebook starting March 22nd. And today is actually my last day at Graphcore. And Graphcore is, again, like it's just been a tremendous company for me to work at, where we build like AI hardware. This is just generally revolutionary, the stuff that we work on and the speed ups we get. But I had like a tumultuous path before getting there. Like I think before that, I had tried to start my own company, Yuri, which was a reinforcement learning startup for game developers. And the sort of most significant outcome from that exercise was me writing a popular ebook. And I'll talk a bit more about how I started to identify as a writer. And before that, like straight out of school, I had the chance to join Microsoft, and there I have like the dubious honor of having tried all three of the engineering disciplines, from applied scientist to developer to product manager. I started off as a product manager. I'll tell you really the motivation behind each of these moves. And yeah, before that, I interned at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. And before that, I was at UCSD, where I did machine learning and CS theory. I really loved math at the time. And before that, I was at the American University of Beirut. And it was very challenging, definitely getting a job in the US with just that bachelor's. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And I think some good advice for internationals that you should keep in mind. So my recent claim to fame was this article I wrote, and I'd been writing for years at this point, but this was sort of like the main article I wrote that incited like a strong emotional response from people. And it was about like what I identified to be a few incentives problems in the machine learning community that made it so a lot of the research was very samey. A lot of people were doing the same kind of math, the same kind of code, the same kind of forks, the same kinds of ideas. And just generally, this felt weird to me. And when I wrote about it, it generated this like insane response. And I had all sorts of people reach out to me and talk about it. And I met all sorts of interesting people out of this article. And I'll talk about this in a sec. But first, I mean, before I talk about this article and really what it made me think and the motivation behind it, I just want to take you to sort of the very beginning. Like my first, before I signed my Microsoft offer, it was like, like I'd applied to be a developer, but the recruiters recommended that I actually try out being a product manager. And the reasoning was that like they felt like I was a good talker, and they're like, okay, well, you could do this, and it's like kind of like you're at a startup, but you just have engineers from Microsoft that you can pick up, and it's like really cool and stuff. And just so you know, in case you've never worked at a big company before, this is BS. Like you don't like there is no such thing as a startup within a big company. Like this is sort of like just a very generous twist of words. It's all about trade-offs and what you're trading off. So, for example, in big tech, what you're essentially trading off is you're trading off a speculative upside, as in, like you're not going to be a billionaire, you're not going to be a multimillionaire, but you're going to do pretty good for yourself because like the salaries are very generous, the equity is very generous, and often like the work is more process heavy because you can't take big legal risks for the company. So that's sort of what you're trading off. Whereas for a startup, you sort of have the maximum upside. Like, there is no limit to how rich you can get. It all depends on your talent and your work and your contacts. But the downside is actually very punishing, as in you're not going to make a lot of money or no money for a long time. Everyone you know is going to think you're insane. Until you're successful, people think like you're like an absolute dork, and so this is just like a very difficult trade-off. But again, because the upside is bigger, you have a correspondingly higher downside. And ultimately, I think academia is sort of like in an interesting middle ground, or at least it used to be, I think, where you're essentially trading off. Like you're saying, I don't want to work on boring stuff, and I'm willing to sacrifice some monetary gain for it. So this is sort of like the trade-offs. And when you're thinking about like what you should be doing, you should make sure that you're okay with this trade-off and not sort of get, I guess, led on by what recruiters tell you. Like just think through these things for yourself and look at the incentives and not what people tell you. And the reason I mentioned this, like specifically for startups, is this concept from economics called ergodicity. So just like as a thought experiment, like let's say I tell you there's 100 startups and the average valuation for those startups is $100 billion. What's the most likely valuation for each individual startup? Well, like the answer is like pretty, like if you know anything about power laws and startups, like the answer is generally, well, there's one startup that's worth $100 billion and then the other 99 are worth zero. So, and this is important because you as an individual cannot hedge your life across multiple outcomes. Like you sort of need to decide what you want to do. You can't do 100 things over at once and then trade your life over your 100 parallel dimensions. But you can, to some extent, do that if you're a venture capitalist. So again, if you're a venture capitalist, you're a lot wealthier than me, you're a lot more successful than me. You can sort of hedge your bets across multiple people and get the benefit of maybe getting an average valuation of 100 billion over your investments, even though most of them failed. But as an individual, this is very difficult to do. But you can take multiple small bets. And so the reason I mentioned this is because definitely when I was younger, like in my early 20s, like I would listen a lot to, I don't know, people like Naval and like these like gurus, and they tell you about how like really it's all about, like because the average valuation of a startup is billions, you should just try, you have nothing to lose. And really the point I want to try to make is that, you should be a bit more honest about your existing skills and contacts. And I think one of the best ways to position yourself to take more risks in your life is to have a safety net, and a safety net as in like you make more money. And so really before you get to the interesting part of life, I think a big chunk of it you should be dedicated towards thinking, how can I build a minimum safety net so that I can afford to take the kinds of risks that I would like? So back to PMing, right? So I was a PM, and this is a very common thing I noticed among people that are PMs, is that you ask them like, how are you? And they tell you, well, I'm very busy. And generally, I think that if you're ever in a job like this, you should try to quit as soon as possible, because if you're constantly busy, it's generally a sign that you're not doing anything interesting, like you're not doing anything hard. If anything, the most successful people that I've met tend to have nothing on their calendars because they just like to think and code all the time or invest in stuff. Generally, if you're going from one meeting to another, you're basically letting other people's priorities heavily influence how you determine your life. And so, yes, it could work out, but at the same time, you're sort of leaving your fate to chance and aggregate chance as well, which is unlikely to generate any sort of useful outcome. And so I don't know, like, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about where, like, I've been working remotely now for a year at Graphcore. And people like have this tendency where, like let's say you'll write a document saying like how you want to do something. Typically, people will still be encouraged to have a meeting about it, so you can basically read the document to them. And so I think it's sort of like a relic of something that worked well when we were in person, where it's very easy to go meet people. But the thing is, like, when you think, the more you think about it, like oral cultures sort of don't scale. Like open source projects work just fine, even though a lot of the maintainers have never met. I've met a couple of game developers that have never met in real life, but have made games together. And similarly, you have like different like people who are part, like let's say, I don't know, the rationalists and people who produce very interesting written content online who've never met. And the reason is simple, like oral cultures don't scale. Like you need written documents to keep track of what you're doing. And so this is something I want to get back to, where I think COVID presents like this interesting opportunity for engineers that know how to write. It's sort of, you can avoid bureaucracy by having your thoughts and your work be publicly available and written. And this is much more scalable than you manually going and telling people about your work. And I'll get to this in a second. So like I said, I mean, I was a product manager, and really, if you ask me what I did, what I basically did was I took emails from one person and then I would send them to other people. And maybe I would, I don't know, add some colors to these emails and simplify it and put it in bullet points. But in general, like I would say as a career path, like I don't think it's particularly interesting, especially early on in your career. I think later on in your career, when you're dealing with projects at scale, it can be more interesting. But as a junior person, I think you should really strive to building real skills. And so thankfully, though, Microsoft is very good with internal transfers. Like I think the reasoning is if you let people transfer, they're less likely to quit. So you can actually keep these people inside the company. And so I switched to being an applied scientist in their natural language processing team. And it was great initially. Like, I mean, I was reading papers all day. I was coding all day. It was like a bliss. I had a lot less meetings, but I still had them. And overall, like, I felt good for a couple of months, like until I didn't. And so this sort of like, I think led to almost like an existential crisis where I was like thinking, well, like, why am I at Microsoft again? Like, I don't really know anyone in Seattle. Like, I just like sort of moved here out of college because the job was good. Things felt slow. Like I needed to get lots of approval from people to do things. There were lots of meetings. Like, I would maybe spend, I don't know, like half of my, like a quarter of my day coding, but the rest of the 3/4 like meetings. And so my reasoning was like, okay, great. I have savings. Maybe this is the best time for me to start a company. And what motivated me at the time was, well, I tried out being a scientist. I tried out being a dev. I tried out being a PM. So I felt like I had all of the almost like core skill sets to start a company. I was like, what's the worst that could happen? And a big part of this is sort of, for me, this is a problem I'm terrified of, which is called like the turkey problem. So the turkey problem is, imagine you're a turkey, right? And you were born in January, and you steadily see your weight rising monotonically until November. And so you're like, life is great. Like I'm going to keep weighing infinitely into the future. Well, but then surprise, like there's Thanksgiving around November, and all of a sudden you weigh 0 kilos. And so this is something I've always like really wanted to avoid and was really scared of in my career, is like, how do I know that even though like I'm getting promoted, that I'm getting more money, how do I know that my skills are still relevant and that I'm going to continue doing interesting stuff in the future? And how do I avoid being a turkey? So again, your skills can be useful until they're not. And generally, whenever you're also in a career path that always seems to sort of monotonically be increasing in a risk-free way, there is a sort of volatility that's hidden. There's a sort of systemic risk that you may be missing. And so again, like this is sort of like, I think one of the issues of engaging too seriously with something like a rat race, which is a rat race is you're very committed to just getting promoted and doing the minimum of what you need to get promoted every year, and that's the only metric that you're optimizing for. Well, like that works really great in the short term, but in the long term, you may be doing uninteresting stuff. As an example, like let's say, I don't know, you joined let's say you were a middle manager at IBM, for instance, and you're doing great. Like you're just sending email from person A to person B, and for some reason the company's valuing this year over year. You're making a lot of money. You're happy. Well, all of a sudden, turns out people don't care about IBM. Like cloud's doing well. All of a sudden, you're like, okay, well, great. I want to transfer jobs, and you realize, like, wait a minute, like I don't actually have skills. Like I don't know how to sell things. I don't know how to code. I don't know how to talk. Like all I know how to do is to send email from person A to point B, and that was rewarded again until it wasn't. So what's a skill, right? And I think whenever people ask me like, what should I learn? It's sort of you want to look at skills that have stood the test of time. And I think here's a couple that have, like, let's say writing. So being able to get people pumped up for an idea or communicate clearly some stuff. Speaking is sort of relevant because people get more of an emotional connection when they see you talk. And related to that, and maybe slightly newer, are skills around investing. So sort of like how to allocate your money, and crafting, which is really around how to allocate your time. And I think again, today in the modern world, like this, like the craftsmen are really, I think, coders and designers to a large extent, because they have the most leverage in their skills. Like as in, you can produce something that millions of people can use. Whereas if you're a woodworker, like yes, you can make great wood, but there's sort of like an inherent limit to how many pieces you can do a year. And there's a limit to how many clients you can make. Whereas online, there is like zero cost with you distributing your work to new people. So what's a skill that's not Lindy? As in, I don't think that will stand the test of time. And I think the skill is middle management. Again, if you're in a career where it's like emailing something from person A to person B, you're very likely to find that your skill is relevant until it isn't. So try to generate skills during this time where you have the luxury of having a job like this. So also a concept I want to talk about that I think is very important. So like a safety net, or maybe more colloquially called a few money, is really how much money do you need to never have to work? And the reason I think this is really important is because people say that like money, like more money is not correlated with more happiness. And I think this is wrong, because at some point, once you get enough money, you have the freedom to pursue interesting stuff. And I do think freedom is highly correlated with your happiness. That said, there is no number, right? That's like, oh, this is how much money you need to have a safety net. It's really a function of your expenses and your income, but it's just something to think about, and something to be pragmatic about. Like how much how do you generate this FU money to be able to feel that you have the luxury of working on whatever you want. So again, when I was at Microsoft, I like my life was very monotonous, and I was like, okay, I want to start my own company, but what I actually meant is I hate my life and I need a change. And so, and if you're wondering why that's the case, like this is sort of what my life looked like. I would wake up at 7 a.m. I would have a shower at 7:30. I'd get to work by 9. I'd have meetings until 5, like back to back. From 5 till 6:30, I'd try to work on some side projects and maybe code. I'd get home by 7:30. I'd cook, I'd eat, I'd stare at the ceiling until 9. I'd play video games until 10. And then I'd go to bed at midnight. And so this was my life on repeat for about 4 years. And eventually I felt like, something was wrong. And I felt like I needed to make a major change. And I thought that like, well, if I have more control over my time, and if I had a few money, then maybe I can sort of break the cycle and have a lifestyle that fits what I care about a bit better. And so really my thing is like, I was just really burnt out. Like, I mean, I was just working all the time. Like my life was sort of like on repeat. And I think what helped me snap out of it was, what I call grandma wisdom, which is like, get some sun, get some friends, like have a partner, and basically work on finding your strengths. And this gets back to this original discussion around like, if you're optimizing too much for metrics, like let's say like promotions, on the outside, it looks like you're doing a great job. As far as your parents are concerned, like you're doing great. But if you sort of feel dead inside, like you should be asking yourself like why that's the case, and maybe spend some more time engineering like what kind of lifestyle that you need to do. And so initially, and a lot of my friends thought I was insane when I first quit, and my family just strongly discouraged me from making this decision. Where I was just like, well, I just want to make video games. And they're like, well, have you made any games before? And I'm like, nope. And they're like, well, do you know how to sell video games? And I'm like, nope. But I thought like, well, I have like, 2 years worth of savings and I'll figure it out. And what was really interesting about this exercise is even though I'd never produced like a successful game, I learned a lot about software and about myself throughout the process. Like as an example, slow games aren't games. So I learned a lot about low-level performance. I learned about graphics. I learned about physics programming. I learned about like computer architecture about like software architecture and how to structure a game so that you can add features easily to it. About computer security, when I learned how to hack games because I wanted to disassemble games and figure out like my favorite games, how did people make them, and what were the programming patterns they used. And really, it's about like how do I make something that I find fun, which is important when you're trying to sell anything, which is how do you make something that people love. And eventually, while I was working on, like, I like strategy games, and I was working on a strategy game, and eventually I wanted to make a good AI for this game so that I could balance it. And I was like, wait a minute, there is no like good solution for this. So maybe I'll make one. I was like, aha, like, that's what the company is going to be about. And so this was really the goal of my company, Yuri AI. And I had a couple of ideas for it around like automatically adjusting the difficulty of a game, uh, coaching player, like having an AI be as good as the player throughout time so that you can basically train yourself for competitive play for things like esports. Maybe also have a drop-in replacement for multiplayer games. So if someone disconnects, you can just like swap in a bot that's of a similar skill. And I had a whole bunch of ideas for how to make this work. And I had like a couple of prototypes that I had worked on, like in a couple of like small, like terrible games that I made myself, like the games I was working on. So, this is sort of like a visualization of what this may look like. Let's say this was a soccer game, for example, where the players can sort of change in size or become faster on a cooldown. And so this was the demo that I would show people when it was like, like, what can you do with this? And I showed them like, look, automatically the bots figure out, well, if I can become bigger, that means I should probably be the goalkeeper. And if I can go faster, well, that means I can probably be the striker. And so you don't even need to hard code roles anymore. You just have agents figure out like what they're best at, and you have like these emergent behaviors. And because I loved AI and I loved ML, I thought like, well, obviously everyone will want to do this. Like this makes a lot of sense. It's a lot better than this decision tree approach that I'd seen people follow in the past. But then I learned like a very like bitter lesson, which is that cold calling is really hard. Like, I mean, if you've ever imagined like, I don't know, like an AT&T representative calling you and trying to convince you why you should upgrade your internet, and you're telling them to like go away and leave you alone. That gives you, imagine the other side, right? Which is it's really hard to convince people to spend money. And so I would send emails that looked like this, like, hey, gaming company, like, do you want to have like great game AI? Like, here's a prototype you can take a look at. No answer. And that, or I would say, well, hey, gaming company, would you like some great game AI? And they'd say, well, who are you? Like, why should we trust you? How do we know that you're going to be around? How much money do you have? Who are your investors? And I was like, fuck, like, I mean, oh, excuse me. So I was like, damn, like, I don't have enough to have credibility with these people. Like, they have no idea who I am. Like, why would they trust me? And sort of like bitterly and almost as a consolation prize, here's around the time when I was thinking, well, okay, I don't think this is working out. Like maybe it needs more time, or I need to incubate this idea a bit longer. So why don't I just like write down like a book to sort of summarize everything I learned working on this, and all the ML parts and the reinforcement learning parts and the robotics part and the graphics part. So me going through this process, like I had to go through a lot of research papers. There were no good textbooks about these topics. So I thought I'd summarize these ideas myself. And the book was actually a consolation prize. Like I was actually very upset that the outcome of my 2 years of me working on my own startup would be me writing an ebook. However, I was very pleasantly surprised when the ebook ended up becoming like sort of the marketing channel of my dreams, because a couple of chapters made it to the front page of Hacker News. Let's say my automatic differentiation post is the top post on Google if you search for automatic differentiation. My reinforcement learning ones are also one of the top ones. And so I was like, wow, like now people were reaching out to me and asking me like, hey, Mark, like, how can I do this kind of reinforcement learning things in my games? And I was like, oh, wow, like I wish instead of like sending these like stupid cold calls, like what if I just actually made it so people wanted to reach out to me instead of like begging for people's attention? And so I wrote this book chapter by chapter, and I was publishing it online. And here's what the book wasn't. Like the book wasn't an academic text. Like I didn't write it in LaTeX. I also didn't use a publisher, which I had the opportunity several times of using a publisher. But just if, in case you don't know, like I generally believe the publishing business is a scam, because people will give you like in advance of like, let's say $1,000, which doesn't even pay for a month's worth of rent in California. And then a book takes you what, like 6 months to a year to write, and then out of the proceeds you get maybe like 5% of the, or maybe 1% of the money back. And even then they don't necessarily guarantee you an audience. It's sort of like, if you're popular, great, your people will read your book, and if you're not, that's fine. And this goes back to this ergodicity problem. A publisher doesn't lose much by giving you $1,000 if your book is unsuccessful, but you do, because you're going to spend 6 months to a year writing a book, and if no one reads it, it's a big deal. Like you just wasted 6 months to a year of your life. So again, the book I wrote, it took me about 6 months to write this book, The Robot Overload Manual. You can check it online. And the first chapter took me 6 months to write, but every chapter after that took me about a week. And my point here is that like when you tend to overthink stuff and you're like, it has to be perfect, I think perfectionism is not a useful trait. Patience is not a useful trait. I think the faster you can get it out, the better, because what matters is not the amount of time that you spend on something, it's the number of iterations that you have on it. And so I also think, related to this, a grindy discipline is overrated. Like if you find yourself hating what you're working on, but you're still doing it for 12 hours a day and it's taking every bone in your body and you're setting up systems like Pomodoro to be able to manage like your day-to-day life. It's that's sort of like your body telling you like, hey, I kind of want you to work on something else. Like, why don't you find something that you're better at or something that you're more interested in? And so generally, like what I liked about this book, and part of the reason why not having a publisher was interesting, was because I was able to pursue topics that no publisher would pay me to write. For example, like let's say writing about Lie groups, which is like no one in machine learning has heard about, or thinking about how could category theory be useful to formalize like machine learning libraries, or maybe extend some of my thoughts around why homeschooling is a big deal when homeschooling before homeschooling became standard like post-COVID. That said, sharing your work online can be very painful. Like for example, like this was a bunch of people asked me for an article about like what are my favorite technical books. And so I wrote this Medium post and I made a long list. And then this was the top comment on Hacker News was like, well, I had said in my article about 1.5 years ago, I quit my high-paying job as an applied scientist at Microsoft, and I was learning about my startup, and I wrote this book list. And then they tell me, and it's already reduced to spamming Amazon affiliate links. Like this stung. Like this comment really, really upset me. But at the same time, it's a function of whenever you publish anything online, you're going to have people that love you and you're going to have people that hate you. And I'm going to also, propose some strategies for how to deal with haters and why their comments generally don't matter. So after like writing the book and the book was starting to get successful, I was like, okay, well, I'm still not making money out of this thing. I was making a lot of money before, and like I'm looking at my negative balance like every month. And most of my savings at the time was equity. It was Microsoft stock. And the stock market was doing brilliantly well for a long time, like the whole 2 years when I was basically, I didn't lose money while not making money. And I was like, great, like this can go on forever, right? Like back to the turkey problem. Like this is great, so it can go on forever. And then COVID hit and the stock market tanked. And I lost like, like half of my savings in a couple of days. And I was like, damn, like I really need to make some money again. And I started applying to jobs again, but a lot of companies were having hiring freezes. It was really hard to find a job. The job market was very saturated. And so pre-COVID, I could have found a job maybe in a week, but now post-COVID, it took me actually 3 to 4 months to actually find an interesting opportunity. And part of this was that, like, when you look at coding interviews, one thing to keep in mind is that what are they actually testing for? Like, coding screens aren't actually about coding. They're actually stress tests. They're actually a measure of how confident you are and how much you can deal with stress. So I was really stressed because I was running out of money. I was also very desperate. I really wanted the job. And so no surprise, like, I would be anxious. I'd get insecure if people like called me out on some stuff that I did badly during my tech screens. And I didn't do well. And I also learned this sort of thing that no one likes to say out loud, but people that don't take risks generally in their lives tend not to respect risk takers that failed. And I think people do this because they use this as a way of justifying why they didn't take risks themselves. And so that's just something to keep in mind. It's like one of the downsides of failing to start a company that no one tells you, but is important to keep in mind.
Mark, this is Terrence. Mark, is that basically the people that you were interviewing with? They're sitting across the table already judging you for, oh, you did a startup and you're not a billionaire?
Exactly, yeah. So it was especially on the larger company side that we're doing this. And to me, what I was thinking deep down is, I was thinking almost like, how dare you? Because like, I mean, have you ever taken a risk in your life? Like besides, like, I don't know, maybe disagreeing with your manager once. So you don't know what it's like. But at the same time, I mean, it's sort of, to me, I generally found it not helpful to sit and be bitter about, what other people think about me. It's sort of like, learn what you can, move on. Like, it's okay, it didn't work out. But again, yeah, like I think like smaller companies definitely when I would interview with them respected my story. And because I wrote about it as well, like I actually wrote a blog post saying all the ways in which I messed up at Yuri. And among startup founders, they really resonated with the story. They're like, oh, wow, like this is something that would have happened to us very easily. Whereas at bigger companies, they tend to think like, no, like I am innovative. But no, you're not. Like you never quit your job. You never did anything that your manager didn't tell you to do. You never worked on a project that wasn't already mainstream. So you don't really know what risk is. So it's kind of disingenuous for you to judge other people.
But I guess what that's saying is that it's actually a good filter because you don't want to work for that kind of a place.
Absolutely. I have a blog post actually about this on the myth of objective tech screens. It's my newest Substack blog post. But I described there the best tech interview I've ever had was at a company that basically walked through Yuri with me, like basically what it went, and tried to understand basically what would have been the best case scenario. And that was just an absolute pleasure. Like I loved that person for basically, being so like one, they tried to make me look in the best light. They tried to present me in the best light possible. And as a result, I ended up doing very well. And I think that's one thing with tech screens where a lot of interviewers treat them in a very, in a quote unquote objective way where they'll go through rubrics. And they're like, tell me what logistic regression is, or what are the most important loss functions. But these questions essentially, even though they sound objective, they end up testing for stress because you're making the candidate as uncomfortable as possible. Whereas I think that subjective interviews where you're like, I want to make you look as good as possible, and then basically compare candidates on their best possible behavior, not on what they look like when they're really stressed and anxious and very uncomfortable. And I noticed like a lot of my best interviews were all like that. So I definitely think like, let's say if you look at actually companies like Google and Facebook, you could be bombing, but they'll still be very nice to you. Whereas companies like Amazon, not so much. Like they'll treat you very harshly during interviews. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah. No, I guess I'll never get hired by Amazon again by saying this out loud. It's like,
but anyway, edit that in post-production.
Yeah, excellent. So I was very fortunate to find a job at Graphcore. And so what Graphcore was trying to do is they had like their crazy new hardware, and they were trying to teach scientists like how to use it. And so my job initially was actually sort of an engineer on the sales team. And initially I was sort of feeling kind of upset about this. I'm like, well, I don't really care about sales. Like sales is gross, but it's okay. Like maybe I'll still learn a lot about the hardware. But in hindsight, it ended up being the best job I've ever had. Specifically because our customers were researchers, it sort of got me on this path of thinking, great, who are the most interesting possible researchers I can collaborate with? Let me find what's interesting about the hardware to them and to me. We can write a paper together. And if the paper is materially valuable to them, then great, we can, they can actually buy our hardware and we can actually have a sales partnership with it. So this way I had the opportunity to collaborate with Misha Laskin and Luke Metz. So Misha is in Peter Abil's lab at Berkeley, and Peter is one of the researchers I admire the most. This is my very first machine learning paper, ended up being with one of the researchers I admire the most, and with a very unique way of training neural networks in a completely local way. Similarly, on the right, this is a blog post that was written by Michael Bronstein, who is one of the most prolific graph neural network researchers in the world. And so I cold called him as well. And I was like, hey, like I think GNNs can be accelerated very heavily on our hardware. Like, why don't we work together? And turns out he's also like a performance and hardware head. He got really excited about it. And then he ended up featuring me alongside people that discovered the Higgs boson. And so for me, this was just like absolutely mind-boggling. Like, how am I working with these people? But a big part of it was just bothering to reach out. Like, I'm not especially smart. I'm not especially gifted. I'm not especially disciplined. But like, I try to keep an eye out for like, what are problems that are interesting, and try to convince the people that I work with, like why this is a good use of their time. And they tend to resonate a lot with it. And so this is contrary to how people typically cold call. And you may have seen this on LinkedIn, for example, where people are like, let's connect and share notes. Like, no one wants to connect and share notes. But if you tell me like, hey, like, I improved, like, let's say you want to reach out to Terrence, for example, like probably a good heuristic to do this is to tell him like, look, I wrote like a great tutorial on Antler, or I looked at an open source project of yours and I made the following improvements, or I extended the use cases for this. You're definitely going to get Terrence's attention. But if you just email Terrence and tell him like, hey, Terrence, do you want to connect? He's probably going to miss it. So just something to keep in mind when you're learning how to cold call people. So this sort of like, and sort of now I can finally introduce like the motivation behind this whole Great Stagnation post, where I essentially was purposefully controversial and I called machine learning researchers today's medieval Catholic priests. And what I meant by that is that they can engage in like risk-free, high income, high prestige work by, for example, taking BERT, adding some stuff to it, making it incrementally faster without it being proved in a production use case, get paid 6 to 7 figures for it, and still think of themselves as thought leaders. And so I just thought like when I would look at this, it was a feeling that a lot of people in the machine learning community had felt. But I think I did like a good job of sort of summarizing the main ideas in a funny way and in a way that sounded like myself. And it ended up resonating a lot. Like, for example, like the reason I'm showing you this email list here is 882. So this was from one blog post that I wrote, whereas from my startup that I worked on for 2 years, I got about 50 people sign up to my email list. Like 50 if you exclude like my mom and dad, for example, but like 50 people that like care about reinforcement learning in games. And so this is just something I want you to think about, is that like, well, when you're producing interesting, like when you're trying to create content, generally the harder you are trying to sell something, the more people are not going to care about you. And the more genuine your thoughts are and the bigger of a risk you take in your articles, often people resonate with it more. And so here I criticize machine learning researchers. I criticize OpenAI. I call machine learning researchers like basically glorified DevOps engineers. And so I'm criticizing a lot of my readers, but a lot of them have the humor and self-awareness to realize this. And that's why I think a big part of why this article resonated with people. And so really there's sort of in this article, I think a few key themes that I think are very important when you're thinking of how to do interesting research, because it really applies beyond just machine learning or software. So again, back to haters. This was one of the comments that I got on this post, like one of the earliest ones. It's like, it's safe to say that the headings, the musings of a moron, like most Hacker News content, and you're better off reading the summary of this on Engate in a week. And one thing I realized about trolls in general is that often trolls don't produce interesting content themselves. And so they're just like sort of like angry and they're hiding behind some anonymity and calling you out. And so generally you can diffuse trolls in two ways. Like one, be funny. So like I was like, oh, you're not wrong, I am a moron. And then the other way you can diffuse trolls is sort of calling them out. It's like, well, do you have an article I can check out where you like make a better case or make the opposite case? And generally the answer is no.
Mark, I have a question from the audience. This is from Rodrigo. He says, if the more we interview, the better we will do, what's your approach on selecting which coding screens or interviews to attend first, while increasing our skills and not wasting good opportunities?
All right, that's a good question. So like, for example, like I recently got an offer from Facebook. It's perhaps like, but I had failed like 4 to 5 interviews with Facebook before. Typically these big companies will interview you like they're happy to interview you every year, as long as there's like a difference in your skills. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Like I would say in general, like the way to prep is, there's no, like, unfortunately, there's no like, it's not rocket science in the sense that like the more you prep, the better you get. But the best prep is the real one, because like I had lots of interviews that I bombed. And I have a whole article, by the way, that just describes all of my bombs. Like it's just one after the other. And you're going to see really how visceral they can get. But the reason I wanted to post them and is to show people like there's a lot of them. And you never forget your failures. Like, like let's say you did something on LeetCode, but you messed it up. Like you're not going to think it's a big deal, right? Whereas like, let's say I will never forget how to implement breadth first search in my life, because blanking out and forgetting how to implement breadth first search cost me a researcher role at MSR. I will never forget how to do Monte Carlo tree search because it cost me a job at DeepMind. And so like I can very vividly associate different problems with jobs that I really wanted. And so I would just suggest like do more, and it's fine. Like, I mean, yeah, like if you have the chance to get your dream job 1 year out of school, that's amazing. Like good for you. Like you're very lucky. But if you don't, it doesn't mean the world is over. You can just keep trying, and no one's going to remember about the times you failed. People only remember about the time you succeed.
Mark, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
that's pretty amazing to me that they want you to remember very specific algorithms. Although breadth first search is fairly common. It's surprising that they would ding you on one specific algorithm.
Yeah, like actually, that interview was a funny one, the MSR one, because my first interview was basically, oh, can you tell me how logistic regression works? And I sort of did the whole derivation from scratch with the logits and the softmax and like everything and all the derivatives. And the guy was like, his eyes, like he came out of his skull. He's like, wow, like this is so cool. Like you're gonna work with us, and well, then we're gonna send you over to MIT, and you're gonna get a PhD at MIT. And I'm like, I was on cloud nine. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds so amazing. I was really young at the time. And I was also in a PM job that I hated. So it was like, it was sort of like, oh my God, like this is happening. Like finally someone understands me. And then I bombed breadth first search. And that's why like I had like, it was so crushing, because it's not just crushing after, it was also crushing during, because I forgot that I needed the queue to basically keep the track of the nodes that I needed to visit.
Yeah.
And so I blanked out. And then 10 minutes into blanking out, I'm like, I'm not doing well. Damn, I lost this job. Damn, it's all over. And then you sort of get the spiral. Whereas if I just like calmed the F down and again, remember that interviews are a stress test, I would have remembered, oh, yes, I've done breadth first search a billion times. Oh, yes, it's a queue. And then I could have had a job at MSR. And so that's why I think stress is sort of the number one killer in tech screens. And people think it's about the coding. I don't think it's about the coding at all. It's about your ability to manage stress.
Okay, cool.
But also it's important to keep in mind, like, you're going to have haters for stuff that you produce online, but you're also going to have fans. So for example, like if I didn't write this article, I wouldn't have met Terrence. And Terrence is one of the engineers that I admire the most. And so it's insane to me that even though I didn't contribute directly to his work, we're not even in the same field, but the fact that we got to meet out of something I wrote, for me, it was just amazing. Terrence, want to say anything?
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, of course. But I also got invited to some podcasts. Like, for example, like my favorite ML YouTuber is Yannick Kilcher, and I got invited to a podcast to talk more about something that I wrote. At Graphcore, a lot of my customers had read the stuff that I wrote. And so it sort of like becomes like this feedback loop where, oh yeah, like they know me. And so now it's easier for me to meet them. But I also have more confidence to reach out to them. And generally, like I'll say, I've become very comfortable, reaching out to pretty much any interesting person that I can find online, because I figured out basically a way to not spam people. And the way not to spam people is that when you reach out to them, you basically tell them how you're going to help them. Not tell them this, like, do you want to talk so that I can help you? How can I help you? Like, tell them very directly, like, I did this thing, like, look at it, and then great, and don't expect anything in return. And this approach tends to really work, because in the open source community, one thing that I found really shocking is that, let's say, like you look at a project like TensorFlow or PyTorch, right? So I'm assuming these are projects that almost everyone in this class has experimented with. And there's probably tens of thousands to maybe hundreds of thousands of people that use these libraries day to day at this point. But the amount of people that actually develop these libraries is not in the hundreds, it's in the tens. And maybe it's even like, you can maybe count like 5 people who, like, let's say, were magically hit by a bus, the TensorFlow project would die. And so you're like, the more I met people in the open source community, the more I realized there's very few of them. So you may think that the space is very crowded, but you'll realize, like, no, it isn't. It's a very small community. And so if you're valuable in this community, you're going to meet interesting people very quickly, and you're going to do interesting stuff very quickly. And lastly, and this is more of an interesting observation of mine, is that when I was actually interviewing with the PyTorch team, most of them had already read my articles. And this is very powerful, right? Because typically when you're interviewing, people are thinking like, like they're not really sure, like most people who interview are very bad. And so like you're coming to the interview, and the interviewer is just like thinking, okay, well, how's this person going to bomb? But if they already know you or know about you, then they're sort of starting off the conversation on a more positive note. So they're more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt if you mess up on something. And so that's just like a very important thing to keep in mind.
Mark, we have a question from Flora. Flora, go ahead. I think we still got your mute button on. Flora, your mute button's on.
Maybe
that's all right. We'll keep going, Mark, and we'll catch up with her later.
Okay, I see something in chat though. Okay, so let's see. So
in chat. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so I see from Flora. So when putting out controversial articles, aside from the trolls, are you ever concerned about being too offensive and potentially burning bridges? This is a great question. So okay, so one of the controversial things I said in my post was I called OpenAI a media company. And the reason I call them a media company is because they produce amazing, beautiful demos with this amazing typography. And I'm like, well, but like, you're like, oh, how, like, can I use the thing that you did? And it's like, no, it's too dangerous to release. And so I was very well aware that, like, one, by the way, just to be clear, I have applied to OpenAI and been rejected a couple of times because I really wanted to work on their Dota team because I love Dota and I love the work that they did. But at the same time, like, my observation with offensive articles is that, like, yeah, like there's always a risk of burning bridges. But generally what I found is that if your point is not, oh, closed AI, like it's a bit more nuanced, like OpenAI is a media company. I actually have people from OpenAI that follow me on Twitter that enjoyed my posts. And so it ends up working out just fine because as long as your point is interesting, people tend to not take these points too personally. And the second point is there's almost like no risk without, like there's no reward without risk. And what I mean by that is that like one of the most common question I get asked, by the way, is should I do a PhD in machine learning? I'll get to that in a second. The second most common question I ask is how can I become a better writer? And so I think what people end up doing is that they do what I call like cookbook articles. So they'll go and they'll be like, okay, how to do logistic regression in PyTorch. And then they'll, look at a tutorial or they'll look at an famous textbook and they'll basically copy paste it and make it very clear. And then they'll publish that on Medium and then they'll pad their article enough and then they call that a portfolio. I think this is total BS because people know that you're padding your article when you're doing this. And what ends up being more interesting is, one, if you pick articles that are more niche, or if you make points that are more controversial, you immediately stand out by just being a more interesting person. And so, yes, there's always a risk, but as long as the risk you're taking is interesting, it's generally worth it. Actually, I had this experience recently. My interview post, the one where I describe all the interviews that I bombed, my mom heavily told me, don't publish this, don't publish this, don't publish this, like many, many times. And I'm like, I think it's still interesting. Like, I kind of want to post this. But then, when I did post it, a lot of people reached out to me. It's like, wow, oh my God, like this is so inspiring. Or, wow, I can't believe like you had the courage to like write about all these failures. And so my point is, like, you'll generally be pleasantly surprised by people's opinions of you after you take a risk. So sorry, I talked a lot about this, so maybe I'll keep going. So generally, back to this point around cold calling, is that a lot of people, like, they'll get started on Twitter, for example, and then they'll have like any sort of random thought, and then they'll like, add Dion LeCun to the thread, or they'll add, like, let's say, or Nassim Taleb, like they'll add the most famous people they can think of. And they're basically looking almost like, I would say, for like a parental figure. It's like, I just want this like older person that I admire to appreciate me and realize that like I'm smart and help me become popular. And I think this is a very bad approach because it looks very needy. And generally, like, people don't want to interact with other needy people online. People want to interact with interesting people, inspiring people. So like the quicker you can become interesting or inspiring, the more you can sort of skirt this like begging for attention kind of approach. And I think one approach that does work well is that when you're looking online, I think people use the internet in two ways. Like, one is to meet people. One is LinkedIn, which is you're spamming people, like, let's connect. And the other is, like, let's say, more Tinder, which is, okay, let's hook up. And I think there's sort of a middle ground, which is like, let's become peers. Like, let's talk about ideas in an interesting way together. And so a good way to do this is you find interesting people online and that aren't famous yet, and you ask them about their work and you learn more about their work and you contribute back to their work. This works a lot better than reaching out to the most famous people you can think of. And generally, like, I think I think one thing that's really lost in machine learning today is the sort of first principles thinking. So there's a new transformer paper being produced like almost daily at this point. They're all state of the art. They're all interpretable. They're all the best thing ever. And none of these things can be mutually true together. And so that's why I think the sort of first principle thinking is very important. And this is one example I gave of it where, let's say you're looking at how to implement various models in neural networks. You're going to look at an RNN tutorial. You're going to look at an LSTM tutorial. You're going to look at a CNN tutorial. But if you were to take a step back and take a more first principles approach, you're going to realize, like, wait a minute, like, all of these models are basically me taking some linear layers with some sigmoids in between. They kind of all are the same, and they vary in this very incremental way. And once you start thinking this way, it makes it very easy for you to filter out the noise, where you can look at a new piece of work and you're like, okay, this is incremental or this is a big deal. And that's why, like, what you want to avoid desperately in your career is what I call tutorial hell, which is, you're like, I'm just going to do this one more tutorial, and then I'm finally going to be able to start on project X or this open source project X, or I can finally write a blog post about this. And this is basically, me after finishing all the ML tutorials that I've bookmarked. Like, it's never ending. There's an excess of content that's very bad online. And so get to producing more than consuming, and just like try to figure stuff out from first principles, and you'd be surprised. Like, I would say, there's probably, I don't know, like millions of people that have read about CNNs and LSTMs. I would venture that there's maybe thousands or tens of thousands of people that have actually tried. Another thing that I realized in
Mark, can you mention the title of the article on interviewing failures?
Yeah, so it's called the myth of objective text screens. It's my last Medium article.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. I'll paste it.
All right. So another thing I want you to keep in mind is that I notice this a lot in junior technical people, where typically you have people that have no idea what they're talking about, that have all the confidence in the world, and then they're being paid more than the people that know a lot, but just don't know how to present their work in an interesting way. And I think the best example of this is like database engineers. So database engineers have basically been doing what ML production engineers are now starting to learn. They've managed pipelines for years, so they need to work consistently. They're woken up in the middle of the night when data is missing. They keep underestimating their expertise. They're paid very little. Whereas people who've taken like one online class, can call themselves a scientist, can do nothing all day, call their mistakes regularization, and they're making like small fortunes. And so again, skills matter, but one of the most important skills that you can cultivate in your life is going to be writing and speaking. And these will help you make, be happier and make more money. So it's just a shame to not do them, especially that I think it's a low-hanging fruit. I genuinely think that anyone can be a good writer. And if you feel like you can't, feel free to reach out to me after this. And I can give you like some more actionable advice that you can follow. But it's definitely one of these skills that I think will be a multiplier for your skills.
Mark, Daniel has a question. What are your favorite books?
That's a great question, actually. So I'll answer this. Before I answer that, the best way to become a good writer is to find, basically find some niche content that you want to write about, and write in it in a voice that is very close to writers that you really admire. So for example, like my favorite writers are Nassim Taleb. So his books Anti-Fragile and Black Swan, I think, are his best ones. I love George Orwell, like with Animal Farm in 1984. And then thirdly, I really like Chuck Palahniuk, and he's famous for writing Fight Club, which I think most people know of as a movie. But as far as technical books go, I have a whole blog post called Technical Books I Love that goes through this in a lot more details. I have also a blog post called The Sovereign Student, which is basically my favorite books for an introductory computer science curriculum. So yeah, I read quite a bit. I also write about what I read quite a bit, and I write the lists of books that I read extensively online. But yeah, definitely think of your favorite authors that are not technical writers. And if you were to write technical content like them, odds are you're going to write a very interesting blog post. So I see a lot more questions popped up now. Did I miss anything?
No, I think we are okay. I'm answering them. Go ahead. Yeah, so we'll start, I guess maybe another 5 minutes or so. Or are we getting to a stopping point in the next 5-10?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so another bias I want you to be very mindful of in your career is this idea of fake rigor, which is you can say lots of BS with very complicated math. It doesn't mean that it's correct. So like, let's say, assume the data is on a manifold of size X, or the network is being overconfident in its result, or you can feel Fourier weights. Like whenever you see these sort of imprecise statements, don't be duped by complicated math. Try to get to the heart of what the math is saying, and you'll just generally make better points. So yeah, I mean, but still, don't take what I said as a discouragement for whether you should be in machine learning or not. There's still a lot you can do with applied ML outside of images and language. And I think hard sciences are one of the most interesting future things you can pursue in your career. Maybe like this I talked about quite a bit, so maybe I'll skip this. I do want to mention like working. Oh yeah, so I want to briefly talk about finding mentors. So I had this interaction with Terrence where, you know, he was telling me, it's like, oh, like I see a lot of myself in you. I was like, are you kidding? You're a much better pro. Like I wish I could be as good of a programmer as you. And he's like, oh, I'm older. And the reason I mentioned this is because, you know, sort of like these pats on the shoulder matter. So trying to find people that you admire online and getting their feedback on the stuff that you're working on is very valuable. So make sure to do more of it. And the best way to get feedback is to actually have publicly facing work. So this is, I think, another good thread that discusses how to do this, like being valuable to open source maintainers is the best way to become an open source maintainer yourself. And if I were to sort of summarize all of these ideas, you know, what does working in public look like? Well, you can summarize papers, and then you can tweet out your best ideas, turn your best tweets into blog posts, then meet some domain experts in a subject area, and then work with them to build a library, get free users for that library, and once you have free users, now you can build a company. And I think one of the reasons why I failed with my own startup is I tried to skip to step 6, and I tried to skip all of the steps. But now with this new approach, I feel a lot more sane throughout the process because I have a lot more intermediate wins in the short term. So I don't know if I'm going to have time to cover everything, but this was the graduate descent algorithm that Terrence alluded to in the beginning, which is you just make some random changes to something, and eventually, you know, things work out just by brute force randomness.
Hey, Mark, we have a question from John, who basically would like to know your recommendations in terms of, you know, using Keras, PyTorch, TensorFlow, scikit-learn. Is it better to focus on one or two, or should you learn them all?
So I would say, like, I mean, doing an introductory model in any of them shouldn't take too long. Like, let's say if you want to do, I don't know, logistic regression and all of them, just to see the differences, you can probably be done in a day for each and get a high level idea. But when you're thinking then about the next step is generally, I will say depth matters more than breadth. So the quicker you can go down the stack, as in here's how XLA work, here's how the graph is compiled, here's how to profile this thing, that tends to be knowledge that people reward more with higher salaries. And it's just generally more pleasant for you because you avoid tutorial hell. If you're just constantly in breadth, you're going to be in tutorial hell. So I talked about this quite a bit, but you know, I think nowadays PhDs aren't as important as they used to be. I think the best reason, I'll just sort of give you a summary of this table, but the best reason to do a PhD is if you want to do independent research, but have failed to do so. I think that's a great reason to do a PhD. And another one is you need a US visa. If you're already doing machine learning in some sort of professional capacity, I think PhDs are vastly overrated and vastly overcrowded. Essentially, this is what the job market looks like today. You have like millions of people that say, I want to work on ML algorithms. And if you paid attention to my previous slide around everything's a matrix multiplication, this is not a moat of a skill set. Like it's not that hard anymore. And there's a lot of people that want to do it. And so, yeah, relating back to the Turkey problem, yeah, you could make good money doing this right now. And you should invest a bit in it. It's not a sustainable career path. And essentially, a lot of modern machine learning is basically boiled down to learning how to use pip, as in you pip install some new library by Hugging Face, for example, you run it on some data, and then instead of reading papers, you look at Yannick Kilcher's summaries, and then you just repeat what Yannick said verbatim to other people. This works fine now. You are going to make money doing this now. But because so many people are doing this, like the music's going to stop at some point. And so that's why it's useful to have core skills, like whether it's compilers or learning frameworks or hard sciences. Try to find an intersection of ML plus something else, or else you're very likely to be a turkey within the next year. I even created a library for people, you know, just pip install a 6-figure career at this point, because I think that's what people are doing by pip installing Hugging Face. So might as well, like who needs to learn software? Just pip install your way to a 6-figure career. But essentially, I think when you're thinking about how to manage this stuff, I think this is a good strategy called the barbell strategy, which is you can have some very safe bets that can let you make good money, like let's say doing BERT. But it's also useful to use the safety net to invest in more risky stuff like open source stuff, media, a startup. So don't get in the trap of over optimizing for very safe stuff, and don't over optimize for very risky stuff before you have a safety net. sort of common sense. This is what your grandmother would tell you. And turns out grandma was right all along. And I think a lot of this reasoning is it's very difficult to be the best in a field, but it's a lot easier to be the best at multiple fields at once. So for example, I'm an ML streamer, writer, and engineer. I'm definitely not in the top 1% of all of them, but I'm plausibly in the top 20% of them, or top 50% even. But the intersection helps me have a unique skill set that I think ultimately has helped me get the good, like the nice career I've had. So Terrence, how much time do we have left? I think I have.
Yeah, I think we've got some time. Keep going, and I have another question for you when you're ready.
Okay, so I would say like early on in my career, the stupidest emotion that I had a lot was being jealous. It's a complete waste of time. Like some of your friends are more hardworking than you. Some of them are going to get richer. Some of them are smarter. Some of them are going to get luckier. Stop comparing yourself to them. See what you can learn from your smartest friends. Like get over yourself, learn about your insecurities, and move on. And basically treat your successful friends as an inspiration and not as a source of jealousy. I think it's very hard to do this. It's definitely easier once you get older, but I guess the quicker you learn this, you'll waste a lot less time than I did. Obviously, don't work on BS careers. Like if you get recruited by a hedge fund to use RNNs to predict stock prices, that's almost like as technical as palm reading. So try to avoid careers like this. Also, don't get too caught into purity. Like let's say, so this meme is basically if stacking more layers gets you better results than complicated more math. It means that who the joker is should be reversed. It's the complicated person not getting results, not the person doing things in the simplest way possible. So there's Richard Suter is a famous reinforcement learning researcher who had this article called The Bitter Lesson, which is essentially in machine learning, scale trumps complexity. And so this meme, I think, has been true for a lot of aspects in my career, where often the simplest thing tends to be the best thing, and the complex thing tends to be the wrong thing. It doesn't mean you should shy away from complexity when it's needed, but falling in love with complexity for no reason besides mathematical purity will just be a waste of your time. And this is a famous thing. Oh, sorry, Terrence, go ahead.
Mark, we have a question from Emre, one of our students. How did you decide on the subject that you want to work on before you quit your job? And how did you find that gaming AI is the right thing that works for you?
You're going to be surprised at the answer. I didn't figure it out. I quit and I was like, I will figure it out. And my reasoning was that it's very hard to figure stuff out if you're locally optimizing. Like my whole life, consider like my whole life was around like, how do I, how do I get a good career? How do I make sure that I keep getting promoted? So I had my head up my ass like so much, and then just quitting and realizing like, oh, I can work on other stuff was very illuminating for me. And I settled on games because I loved games, and I settled on game AI because I tried to make my own games, and I realized the AI piece really sucked. So often you learn by experience. It's much easier than sort of sitting on your armchair and thinking about problems at a high level. Oh, I really apologize. I need to. I actually need to head out in about like 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah.
So I really apologize. Yeah. So I'm happy to take any questions. So yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about interviews, and I guess like one important thing I want to tell you is that try to avoid jobs where you're just going to be a critic. Yeah. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. And of course, if you want to reach out to me after this, feel free to reach out to me at absolutely any time. I'm more than happy to talk.
We have a question from Hashni. What's your special advice for international students that you mentioned about in the beginning?
Yes. So I think for international students, I think the best thing is, be pragmatic. Like I think get a safety net, whether it's money or reputation. So that's why I think getting a big tech job is probably still a good use of your time early on, unless you think at a startup you're going to get a higher upside or the advisor you're working with is exceptional. So that's just like something to keep in mind. Is that like optimize for pragmatic stuff, and once you have your safety net, you can be more ambitious with your upside.
And a question from Trevor about the long-term viability and popularity of Julia.
Yeah, so I think like I would treat it as you don't know if it's going to be long-term viable. So back to the barbell analogy, invest in Julia in the ecosystem as like part of your risky portfolio. But if you're going to go get a job, you can make really good money just pip installing Hugging Face. So it's sort of a shame not to do it and get a good safety net for yourself.
Somebody asked about the article. Who wrote the article called "Bitter Lesson"?
So it's Richard Sutton, a very famous reinforcement learning researcher.
Richard, what's the last name?
Sutton, Sutton.
Okay, Susan. Okay. Another question from Vaishnavi. How do you foresee the job market in this field in the next couple of months?
I would say like it's still probably pretty good in the next couple of months, but core ML is becoming very crowded. So try to be good at multiple things, whether it's DevOps or sales or product or core science, compilers. It's not enough just to know how to use TensorFlow. That's almost like saying, I know how to run bash commands. Like in of itself, it's not an interesting skill. It's interesting only when you combine it with other stuff.
Cool. Well, any other questions from Mark before he has to take off? Here's a question from Jill. Is there an age limit to break into technology industry?
Not that I can tell. I've never had anyone ask me what my age is. But I definitely think there is a bias for people with momentum. People are always going to prefer people that had successful careers early on. But that doesn't mean that, I think one good thing about the internet is that it's very democratizing. So if you do have a publicly facing portfolio, no one cares about your age or pretty much anything else about you that's externally facing. People will judge you for your work a lot more. And I think that's the best thing about the internet, actually, as opposed to CVs.
Yeah, I would say there is age discrimination on the old side, though.
Yeah, that's
technology.
True.
If you're on the older side, they'll be like, "Hey, Grandpa, you got COBOL?"
I know, but I do think as well, like many of the famous open source people I meet tend to be older than I would expect them to be.
Okay, one last question here. Oh, well, let's see. How relevant being a data scientist would be when automation like H2O.ai is already in the market?
I think you just answered your own question. It's not going to be very relevant. Like the job is going to turn into a DevOps skill very quickly. So use this time until people figure out that it's a DevOps skill to make good money from it, but use also this time to invest in other skills that are related. Again, it's not enough just to learn how to pip install and run model.fit on stuff anymore. Like you are no longer going to be able to make good money from this kind of job in the next year or two, I would say.
Okay, one last question. Do product management skills stand the test of time?
I think
for technical people.
Writing and speaking do. Forwarding emails from person A to person B will not. No.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's close it here. Thanks very much for coming, Mark. I really appreciate all the time you put into sort of self-introspection and figuring out all this stuff for us. And thanks for all of your articles online.
I really appreciate it, Terrence. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
PyTorch.
Thank you. We'll talk soon. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. Bye.
And thanks to all the participants and attendees. We'll see you next time.